So I don't know if you ever did this growing up, or maybe you had a friend that did it, but you ever like make something like a replica of something, or to be cool or fit in, or maybe you saw other people do it. Christina, my wife, was telling me this week when she was in middle school. She acted like I was a middle school girl, so I knew this. She was like, limited two was a big thing, and I was like okay, sure, whatever you say. And so we can never afford limited two jeans growing up. And so one time she got a limited two hand-me-down jeans, which I guess is a big deal, but they didn't fit her. And so what she did was she took off the little logo that's on one of the back pockets and sewed it onto one of her own pair of jeans. So she could be like, look, I've got, I'm cool. Or like when I was growing up, now we weren't fooling anybody, but I don't know if anyone ever did this with a bike where, you got like a card and you put it in the back wheel and so you sound like a motorcycle. Anyone do that? Yeah. Well, we even took it a step further. I didn't know what it was called. Apparently they're called pampas grass. Maybe you're thinking of a cattail. But pampas grass is this thing where it's not a stick, but it looks like a stick, and on the end it's got like all this white fluff. And so we would take these things and like put it on the back of our bike so it sounded like a motorcycle, and then like the smoke, the little white stuff was supposed to be like smoke, right? And so like, oh, we're riding a motorcycle. Now obviously we were not fooling anybody. We weren't actually riding a motorcycle, but it felt cool, right? And so we do that sometimes. Like in Christina's case, her jeans were not limited to by any stretch, but it looked like that. And those are fun things. Now, you could do it bigger and get in trouble. Like literally this week, I saw that some guys had been making replica Jordans, which are just sneakers essentially, and had made over $70 million. They got arrested this week and are facing life in prison, right? And I was like, 70, that's crazy, right? And here's the thing though, right? Again, sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's not. And if you're in that situation, like if you own a business or, with social media today, sometimes people create fake accounts to impersonate other people. Like when that happens to you, it matters, right? Whether it's you personally or whether it's your business, you're like, that is not who I am. That is not who my business is. And so it matters to us. We don't want to be represented in a false way. And that is really relevant for what we're talking about today. We are almost to the end of our series through the 10 Commandments, Set Free to Live Free. We're looking at commandment number 2 today. And here's what commandment number 2 says. It's in Exodus chapter 20. It'll be on the screen, but if you have a Bible or one of the black ones, or maybe you have an app on your phone, I'd recommend pulling that out as well, because I'm going to be referencing it as we go through so that you can kind of follow along as we're talking about it. But here's what it says in Exodus chapter 20, starting in verse 4. This is the second longest commandment. And here is what it says. It says this: "Do not make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above, or in the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow to worship them, and do not serve them. For I, the Lord, am your God. I am a jealous God, punishing the children for the father's iniquity to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands." So essentially, the second commandment is not to have false idols. Another way to look at it is to worship the right God in the right way, which I'll explain in a second. But before we talk about this, I want to just mention a few things that we just read in this passage that you might be like, I'm confused about that. I'm not sure what was going on there. And so before we get into what this commandment means for us today, let me just explain a few things. The first thing, it says this in verse 5. It says, "Do not bow down to worship them, false idols, and do not serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God." Now, when you see that, some people have a problem with that. They're like, I'm not going to worship a God who is jealous. That seems juvenile. That seems bitter. And so here's what's going on here. Again, when we typically think of the word jealousy, that's what we think of: wanting something that's not yours, being mad about it, being envious about it. But a better understanding of what the Bible means when it talks about God being jealous is not that he's being jealous in a bitter way, or not that he's being jealous because he wants something that he can't have, but instead it's about his zealous love for his creation, right? The more accurate way to think of it is because God loves his creation so much, and he knows that only he can fully satisfy us. When he sees his people falling away and doing things that are hurtful to them, it hurts him. It's like if you're married, right, and you see maybe your spouse in the arms of another person, you would be jealous about that. Not in a bad way, but it's like, I care about them. We made a commitment to each other. What's going on? Or if you have one of your kids gets in trouble, right, you're jealous for the goodness of your child. Not that they shouldn't be punished, and not that when they do wrong things, they shouldn't learn their lesson, but as a parent, that hurts you, right? Because you want good for your kids. You want them to grow up and live fulfilling lives. And so what the Bible means when it talks about God being a jealous God is it's talking about how his love for his people, his love for creation is exclusive, and it's passionate, and it's intense. It's a healthy jealousy because at the end of the day, everything belongs to God anyway, and when he sees his people falling away, it hurts him. So he's jealous for them for their good, and he knows their good is to follow him. That's the first thing we see. The second thing we see that may sound more troubling to you if you don't actually take a second to see what it's talking about, is in verse 6, it says that I am a jealous God, or in verse 5, and then it continues to say that I'm punishing the children for the father's iniquity to the third and fourth generations, right? So then you read that and you're like, hold up. So God is actually punishing me or punishing people for something they're not doing. That doesn't seem fair, especially in other parts of the Old Testament, like in Ezekiel chapter 20, which is one of the prophets. It says this: the person who sins is the one who will die. A son won't suffer the punishment for the father's iniquity, and a father won't suffer the punishment for the son's iniquity. So you see passages like that even throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, and you're like, is God contradicting himself? What's going on here? What we see going on here is that here's what we know, that God does not condemn the innocent, only the guilty. And so we see this verse, and we're like, wait, what's going on here? What's going on here is sometimes we see something and we kind of stop in our tracks. It doesn't just say God punishes those for their father's iniquity. It continues to say to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. Meaning, here's what he's saying, that if your parents, fall away from worshiping me and are worshiping false idols, if you continue in that, so if the generations that follow continue in that sin, then I have every right to hold you accountable. He's not saying I'm punishing you for what your parents did. What he's saying is that if this generation that is originally getting these 10 commandments falls away, and your sons and your daughters also follow in your footsteps, then you will also be held accountable. So he's not punishing you for something you didn't do. He's punishing you for something that you do. And then the last thing in verse 6, there's a blessing. It says this, that I'm showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. So what he's saying there's not a literal thing like if you love me, then for the next 1,000 generations of people who are related to you, they're going to be good. What he's saying there is that if you love me, if you give me your heart, if you pursue me with your life, then for all eternity you will be with me, in our case, in his kingdom, that you will be blessed forever and ever. So that's some of the background stuff that's going on in this passage. But again, ultimately, here's the command that we should not have false idols, or put another way, that we should worship the right God, which is the true God, and worship him the right way. And this is the difference between the first commandment, which we'll see next week, and this commandment. The first commandment talks about how there should be no other gods before you, how he is the only true God. But this commandment forbids worshiping the true God falsely. So it's not necessarily talking about idols, how we sometimes talk about them, like if you're serving, money or success. He's talking about worshiping God the wrong way. Now you're like, that seems kind of confusing. I don't really understand. Let me give you an example of how this played out. I'll give you an Old Testament example of how this played out for the Israelites. So in 2 Kings chapter 9 and chapter 10, you have King Jehu, who comes onto the scene. Now, at this point, Israel is in the promised land, and they have kings, right? And so before King Jehu is anointed king, you have King Ahab and his wife, Queen Jezebel. Now, they were a very wicked pair, very wicked king, very wicked queen, and what they did was they invited Baal worship, which was kind of some of the foreign gods and the idols of the surrounding cultures, right? And so they created idols to these false gods. They even had priests that they employed for these false gods. And so when Jehu is anointed king, he essentially takes out King Ahab and Queen Jezebel and takes out all of the ministers to Baal, all the false ministers, all the false prophets, and he even takes down the idols to these gods, right? So that sounds good, but then this happens in verse 28 of chapter 10. It'll be on the screen. It says, thus Jehu wiped out Baal from Israel, right? So far, so good. Gets rid of the false idols. But then it says that he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which was a former king of Israel, which he made Israel to sin. That is the golden calves that were in Bethel and Dan. And so here's what's happening. This new king, Jehu, takes out all the old idols, but he doesn't take out the golden calves that were idols to the true king, to Israel. What he did here was he enforced the first commandment, but he did not enforce the second commandment. And you may have been confused about this. I was really confused about this for the longest time, about these golden calves. And so if you're familiar with the story of the Israelites, right, they leave Egypt. Then very shortly after that, Moses goes onto a mountain, and that's when he gets the 10 commandments, right? And he comes back down, and he already sees the Israelites worshiping a golden calf that they had made. And I always read that story, and I was like, they literally, like, God parted the sea. They saw these plagues. Like, why would they think this calf is a god? They literally saw God do these things. What was happening was they didn't think the calf was a god. What they were doing, kind of like what the surrounding cultures did, was they kind of created this calf as an intermediary. So they were worshiping God, but they were kind of doing it through this golden calf, right? So something they could feel and they could touch. And this is why this is such a big problem, because it may sound like, okay, I get it, we're not supposed to make a false idol to God, but at least we're worshiping God, right? So at least our hearts are in the right place. So why is this actually a commandment? Why isn't this just like one of the laws? Like, why is this such a big deal? And why this is such a big deal, especially for the Israelites, and what we'll get into for us today, is that he's forbidding worshiping him the wrong way. And here's what's wrong with idols, that idols are woefully inadequate representations of who God is. So if you make a physical idol, even if it's supposed to represent God, you've made an idol that cannot see, cannot know, cannot act, cannot love, cannot serve, cannot save, can't do any of the things that God can actually do. And so what he's saying in this commandment is that you are supposed to worship me, but you're supposed to worship me in the right way. Do not make false representations of who I am. Which means that the second commandment, again, is not just about worshiping God, but it's also about how we worship him and making sure that we're thinking about and worshiping him in the right way. And here's how this plays out for us today. So for us, especially in America, in the West, we're not necessarily making up physical idols to represent God. But what we do is we kind of make them up in our mind, right? So some people, maybe you're like, I'm not sure I really love the whole justice, wrath of God thing. And so my God, the God that I'm going to worship, is one that's just full of love and full of grace and doesn't hold anyone accountable. Or maybe the flip side, maybe some people are like, I'm not sure I dig this whole grace thing, because then people can just do whatever they want. I think the God that I think should be there is very legalistic, if you don't follow me, you're going to see some severe punishment right away. Or maybe, again, this is just to give an example of how it is in our culture today. Maybe we think of God as a God who doesn't understand sex. And his idea of sex and sexual sin, his standards for it is wrong. And so I'll follow God in all these other areas, but I think he was wrong on this. Or maybe we think, again, another way we can see God falsely in our society today is maybe it's like, when it comes to greed, like I kind of give some money away, but it's really my money. I get to do what I want to do with it as long as I kind of am generous here or there, all right? So we're like, I'm not sure he understands this whole generosity thing. I'll follow him in all the other aspects, but I won't follow him this way. Maybe you hear people say that my God wouldn't do blank. Or they'll say, I like to think of God as blank. Maybe loving, whatever your definition of love is, or maybe this or that. I like to think of God as this way, or my God wouldn't do this or that. And what we do when we think of God in those terms, if we think of God in terms of what we think he should and shouldn't do, as opposed to who he is and what he actually does and does not do, is that we are now making God in our own image. And this is what this commandment is getting to, right? It's getting to us not making gods in our own image. I'll give you an example of maybe how this plays out in life. Maybe when you were middle school or high school growing up, I'm sure this didn't happen to you, right? It was probably one of your friends. But let's say one of your friends has a new boyfriend or girlfriend that's just a jerk, right? And they treat them bad and they manipulate them. And you're telling them, like all of your friends together, you're telling this friend, hey, this person is not good for you. You should break up with them. But what does your friend do, right? Your friend's like, oh, no, they're giving me attention. They love me, right? And so they kind of disregard everything everyone says because in their mind, they have built up to this person to be someone they're not. Like everyone around you is seeing clearly, hey, this is not what you should be doing. But, your friend was so enthralled in the moment that they see this person as someone they are not. Now, on the opposite end, if you're in that relationship, you're seeing someone as better than they actually are. In our case, whenever we modify who God is, we're actually seeing God as less than who he actually is. And again, that is what's going on here. Verse 5 and 6, it talks about this again. It says that God is punishing the children for the father's iniquity to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. So what's happening here is the word that we each have translated iniquity literally means something twisted in the Hebrew. And so what this is saying, what this commandment is saying, is that idolatry is twisting how God should be worshiped, especially for this command. It's not just talking about worshiping false gods. It's talking about worshiping God and following God in some twisted and some different way. And so what God is saying to the Israelites is he's telling them that I cannot be captured. There's no physical form that can capture, that can localize who I am, right? And that's what idols were back then for those people. Now, before we knock them too bad, I think sometimes, we look at people from generations past and thousands of years ago, and we kind of think they're like dumb, like we have somehow got really smarter. And I always think that like if you could like resurrect these people from the dead, they would come back and be like, wow, humans have actually gotten dumber. But anyway, so what was going on here is before we kind of knocked them, like how could they follow false gods? Obviously, those things aren't true. We actually do the same thing today. So, for example, maybe you have a crucifix, and this is more of a Catholic thing, but you still may do it with like the cross with Jesus hanging on it. Maybe you have a necklace or you have it hanging in your house, and there's nothing wrong with that. But whenever you're around that thing, you think you have to act a certain way. You can't say a bad word, or you got to be nice, right? And so what you're doing is you're thinking that this object somehow in some way is communicating with God or is helping you be closer to God. And so when you're around that thing, you have to act a certain way. Or if you have like a Lucky Charm, and I'm not knocking this at all, I'm just trying to give us an example. Like maybe, on game day for your favorite team, you wear something, or like, you have this thing for presentations, or when you go to work and it's like your lucky thing, right? What you're doing there is in some ways you are giving this object God-like qualities. You're thinking if I have this thing, it will somehow do for me what only God can do, that'll make things go well for me, that I'll do better. And I'll just be honest with you, I was really convicted as I was working on this message, because up until this week, every week of New City Church, to help me preach better sermons, I was wearing Lucky underwear. And I had been wearing the same pair since we've started a year and a half ago, until this week. I'm just kidding. I don't wear underwear, so that would be, I'm just kidding, guys, I'm kidding, okay? See, here's the thing. This is a complete side note, but I like have these jokes that I want to tell sometimes, and normally I run them by Christina, and she'll tell me no. I completely forgot to ask her about that one, so I had to just go with it. But that's what we do, right? So sorry. I'll learn my lesson. That's what we do, right? We have these things that we kind of give these God-like qualities, right? Or maybe you have pictures of Jesus or saints, that sort of thing. Like if I'm by this thing, or when I pray, if I pray by this image, then God will hear me more than if I pray by myself. And we even do the false image, false idol thing today. You about once a year, you hear about some piece of toast popping out of the toaster and it's got Jesus' face on it, or some wall that's got Mother Mary's face on it. And you have people flocking to this thing and praying, thinking, if I'm around this thing, then somehow I'll be closer to God. And what God is saying is, do not do that. There is nothing that you can create with your hands or think up in your mind that is an accurate representation of who I am, if it's not who I am. And so here's why this is important. Here's why this commandment matters. It's because when we worship God wrongly, it leads us to worshiping the wrong God. When we worship God wrongly, it leads us to worshiping the wrong God. In one sense, right, when we worship God wrongly, we're worshiping the wrong God in the sense of like, well, that's just not who he is. But also since, here's what this matters, is because worshiping and following Jesus, oftentimes if you're following Jesus, it's not like I'm following Jesus, I love him, and the next day I want nothing to do with him. What normally happens when we fall away from God is it is a slow drift from pursuing Jesus to pursuing something else, or not even pursuing Jesus at all, right? And so we begin to create God in our image. So again, for an example would be, I think God is like this. I don't like that Scripture talks about God like this. And so I'm going to, again, start to make God in my image, right? And then we have something else we have an issue with. And so we start to change God even more. And then but basically what happens after a certain period of time, if we're not allowing God to shape us and instead we're shaping him, is that you find yourself following a God who is not at all anything like Jesus and the God that we see in the Bible, or you've stopped following God altogether. And this is why this commandment is so important, is because often it is a slow fade. Again, so for the Israelites, when they created these golden calves, this is first of all, we would all say, yeah, you probably shouldn't do that, but it is a slow fade from worshiping a golden calf to starting worshiping other images from other gods from the surrounding cultures. And so when we worship God wrongly, it will lead us to ultimately worshiping the wrong God. I like how Tim Keller, who is a pastor and a theologian, he puts it this way. He says, if your God never disagrees with you, you just might be worshiping an idealized version of yourself. And what he's saying there is that in all times, in all places, it's going to be different based on the place at which you live and the maybe historical context in which you live. There are going to be places where God speaks against certain things that a particular culture or people group loves and honors. And so I'll just give you an example, not to harp on this, but this is just a real example. So in our culture in America and the West, we idolize sex and sexual relationships, right? And so what God says about sex kind of goes against what we think is supposed to be. Other cultures might be the grace of God, that God actually cares and gives grace and gives forgiveness. Like, no, God doesn't work like that. You have to earn his favor. And so what Tim Keller is saying there is that there ought to be places, if God knows everything and is perfectly pure and good and is infinitely wise, and we are not, there are going to be times and places that we just have to submit ourselves and trust in him. It's kind of like kids and their parents, right? Parents know things that kids cannot know, right? They have things that they cannot understand. And so there's going to be some times where the parent can't even explain it to the kid because they're not going to understand. They just have to trust them because the parent knows more than the child. And you can multiply that by affinity, right, for us. That there are going to be places for us where God is going to speak against what we think should be. And so what we need to do, instead of making God in our image, we need to allow ourselves to be made in his image, right? And that's how we do this, right? And this may seem heavy, like, man, this is a big deal. How do I make sure that I'm not worshiping God in the wrong way? Here's how we do that, right? Rather than making God into our image, into how we think he should be, we need to be remade into his image, into who he should be or who he is, right? Instead of making God into our image, we need to be remade into his image, right? And how do we do that, right? How do we do that? Here's how we do that. Here's really the bottom line for this morning. Here's what I want us to take away. How do we allow ourselves to be remade into his image so that we're honoring this commandment? And this is how. Here's what we need to know. That the more I pursue Jesus, the more I will worship him as he deserves. The more I pursue Jesus, the more I will worship him as he deserves. And pursuing Jesus is not a half-hearted affair. It's not like when I feel like it, I'll do it, or if things are going good, but if things are going bad, then I'm not going to do it. It's not I'm going to pursue him so I can get something from him so he can fix all the mess that's going on in my life. No, this is about pursuing Jesus for who he is. And listen, this is not just about head knowledge. This is about pursuing Jesus. This is not just about knowing all the right things, right? Because if you've been in church for a while, maybe you've grown up a Christian, right? You could know the right things. Like we can know in our head that Jesus is God and we're supposed to worship him. So it's not just about knowing him. It's actually about pursuing him. Because all of us could know all the right things. It doesn't mean we're actually doing it, right? And here's the thing about these 10 commandments. And we've talked about this throughout the series, that these commandments, it's not a checklist of do this and don't do this. Ultimately, what these commandments are an outpouring of our hearts. That if we're pursuing Jesus and if we love Jesus and we're trying to be more like him, then we will do these things not to get something from God, not because they're the right thing to do, but because they will ultimately bring us closer to him. And that's how this commandment's playing out, right? God is saying, pursue me, give me your heart. Do not make these false things that do not represent me well. And as we do that, we have to remember that this is why Jesus came, right? Jesus came to give us grace because we could not uphold the law and the commandments perfectly. So God sent Jesus to do what we couldn't, so that as we fall short, we still have love and grace and forgiveness. It reminds me of my daughter Finley, who's a little over 3 years old. Like if you have kids, you kind of know the difference between when your kids are like mad and they mess up and they're just really mad, and when your kids are mad and they mess up, but they're trying, right? And sometimes your kid will immediately apologize as soon as they do something wrong. And you know the difference between they're saying sorry because they're not trying to get in trouble, or they're saying sorry because they really didn't mean to do it, right? And so sometimes I watch Finley and her little brain, and she's like, it's like working really hard, and she'll get mad, and she'll get frustrated, and she'll do it. And sometimes she'll do it, and immediately you know she didn't mean to do it, but she's trying to learn to control her emotions. She's trying to learn how to be a human being. And when that happens, I'm not looking at Finley and being like, Finley, get away from me. Finley, I'm so mad at you. Finley, I can't believe you messed up again. No, I'm thinking she's 3 and she's trying, and I just love the fact that she's giving it her all, right? It doesn't excuse the behavior, but you view it differently. And it reminds me, especially with this commandment, and it seems that we can get this wrong really, really easy. It reminds me of a passage I share from time to time, and it's one of my favorite passages of Scripture, but it's in 1 John chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2 is written by John, who is one of Jesus' closest disciples. And in 1 John chapter 1, he's telling us to avoid sin, right? He's telling us we should pursue Jesus. And then he says this. It'll be on the screen. He says this, "My little children, I am writing these things to you, or so that you may not sin. But if anyone does sin," and this is not as like if, you may or may not, it's a when you sin. In fact, other parts in 1 John, he actually says, if you do not sin, you are a liar, because we all fall short, right? So if anyone does sin, what happens? We don't have a God who's mad at us. We don't have a God who says, get away until you make yourself better. No, here's what it says. We have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. He himself is the atoning sacrifice for our sins, and not only for ours, but also for those of the whole world. And so as we're falling and messing up and falling short, God's not saying, get out of my sight. God's not saying, I can't believe you. God's not saying, I'm so ashamed of who you are. I'm so ashamed of calling you my son or my daughter. No, what's happening is Jesus, who gave his life for anyone who would trust in him, is saying, that is my son, that is my daughter, who I love. And they're going to fall short, and that's going to happen. But because of the grace and the perfect life that I lived, they are still my children of who I love. When Finley screws up, I'm not like, Finley, get out of here. No, I'm saying that's my daughter who I love, and her heart is in the right place, and she will fall short, but she's trying, and she loves me, and that is what ultimately matters. And then he goes on to say this in verse 3, and this is how we know that we know him, that we know God, if we keep his commands. The one who says, I have come to know him, and doesn't keep his commands is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, truly in him the love of God is made complete. And this is how we know him. This is how we know God, not just by saying it. This is how we know him. The one who says he remains in me should walk just as he walked, talking about Jesus. And what John is saying here is not that you're going to be perfect all the time, but what he's saying that if you're pursuing Jesus, and if you desire Jesus, even as you fall short, your life should be a representation of where your heart truly lies. And if you love God and if you're pursuing Jesus, you will fall short. All of us will fall short. All of us will mess up. All of us will screw up. All of us will blow it. But if we actually care about Jesus, we will pursue him with our hearts. Again, the more I pursue Jesus, the more I will worship him as he deserves, not as a false representation of who he is in my mind. And again, here's why this is important. Here's why we need to pursue Jesus for who he is, not for who we think he should be. Again, it says this in verse 6 at the end of this commandment. And why should we do this? It says, God will show faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. And what I love about this verse is it is such a contrast to the previous verse that said that God will punish the generations to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. Right? You see this contrast here that God desires to love his children, desires to give his children grace, desires to give his children mercy. And so he has 3 and 4 generations compared to 1,000 generations, which is just forever and forever, that God desires to give us grace if we will call on his name. And so if you grew up in a family, let's say, that didn't love or worship God, you need to know that there is grace for you. If you have followed God for a while, maybe you're in a season of turning away from him and things are going bad, you need to know that there is grace for you. Maybe you've spent your entire life far from Jesus, wanted nothing to do with him, and now you kind of have some questions and you're not really sure and you kind of think God's going to be really mad at me. What you need to know today is that there is grace for you. There's not grace for you after you get everything together. There's not grace for you a month from now. No, there is grace for you today, and that's who Jesus is. And this is why, hear me, this is why this commandment is so important. Here's why this commandment is so important. Because God is a perfect God. He is a loving God. He is a just God. He is a gracious God. He is a merciful God. And when we make God into our image, we make him just as imperfect and as flawed as we are. Like, I'll just be honest with you real quick, right? I'm a pastor. I'm supposed to have everything all together. I mean, I am prideful. I am selfish. Like when Roman, our 6-month-old, has a blowout diaper, my first thought is I'm going to clean this up so that my wife doesn't have to do it. No, my first thought is I hope Christina sees this before I have to get off the couch, right? When we get in an argument, my first thought is, man, I'm so sorry. I want to love. No, my first thought is I'm not apologizing until she says she's sorry, right? That is my first thought. And here's why this is important, is you do not want a God like you. You do not want a God like you. And I think a lot of times we kind of pretend that we have it all together. If we're being honest, we know we are flawed and we are screwed up. And I'm just using me as an example. I do not want to serve a God who's thinking about them first, about how they can get the best out of the situation, how they can kind of uplift their own name, how they can be prideful. No, I want to serve a God who laid down his life for me, not because I deserve it, but because he loved me. You do not want a God like you. And that is why this commandment is so important. Listen, when we uncover our idols, the false ways that we view God, that will ultimately lead to restoring and providing us the blessing that God is talking about here. That even if life is not going the way you want it, even if you face tragedy and difficulty in your life, you know that this life is not all there is, and that you will be blessed for thousands of generations, not because of what you have done, but because of what Christ has done for you. And so when God is jealous for us, this is what he's jealous for us about. This is what he wants us to experience. He wants us to experience his perfect love and his perfect grace. Listen, God is not a God that we kind of make up in our mind. Again, maybe we think that God is a user-friendly God, so I just got to be nice, and he's just my buddy. Or we think that God is always mad at me, and so I got to get on my right behavior. Or we think that if I'm good, that God better give me what I deserve. If not, I'm going to be mad at him. Like, these are all false representations of who he is. And if you want to see who God is, I love what it says in Colossians chapter 1, that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. That Jesus is God in flesh, showing us that he is a God of justice and a God of grace, and that he is taking the punishment that we deserve so that anyone who follows and trusts in him will be able to have this blessing that we're seeing in this commandment, that for all of eternity, for all of your existence, that you and I will be in his kingdom when there's no more pain, suffering, death, decay, destruction, depression, none of these things, that we will be fully satisfied in him. And so instead of remaking God into your image, we need to allow us to remake us into his image. In Genesis chapter 1, in the very beginning, that's what God says. He says, let us make man, human beings, in our image. And the more I pursue Jesus, the more I will worship him as he deserves. Let's pray. God, we love you. We are so ungrateful of your grace and of your mercy and of your kindness. God, you take your name seriously. And the reason you take your name seriously is because there is no other name that could ever exist, that will ever exist, that is perfect and good and gracious. There is nothing in this world that can give us what you can give us. And there's certainly nothing in this world that can give us what you will give us in the life to come. And so, God, I am thankful for your jealous love for your kids. I am thankful for your jealous love for your creation, for your children, because what we see in the cross is that you coming and dying to show us how much you love us, so that any of us, no matter where we are, no matter where we've been, can know that there is grace for us, and that ultimately you don't want us to follow a checklist, you don't want us to do right things and not do wrong things, and all those things matter. What you really care above all is just our hearts, and it's just us following you. So God, I'm so grateful for who you are. God, I just pray that we would be reminded of your goodness.